My name is George Galloway, presenter of كلمة on Al Mayadeen television. Morning to you. I don't mince my words. I speak كلمة and my audience does too. كلمة free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing Taiwan, China, and the United States of America. The question we are posing is, how big a price will America pay for the egregious, gratuitous offense to the People's Republic of China by the visit of Nancy Pelosi, the third most important person in the American state? I know it's hard to believe, but it happens to be true. After President Biden, Kamala Harris, comes Nancy Pelosi. Therefore, offending not just the international legal principle of one China, agreed by virtually every government in the whole world to be their own policy, but offending the national integrity, the national sense of themselves, of 1.5 billion Chinese people, and many more around the world. This was a slap in the face to China. No one should be in any doubt about that. China responded verbally, rhetorically, in the fiercest possible terms, especially before the fact. The president of China, Xi Jinping, said that he who plays with fire runs the risk of being burned. In the end, the only thing that was burned was the marine life around Taiwan, because China's onshore batteries fired many a salvo, that's for sure, but all of them landing harmlessly in the sea. That might not be true when the American fleet arrives in the Taiwan Straits. This is, if you like, a double slap for China from the United States. I was just recalling what we call the Amethyst Incident and what the Chinese call the Yangtze Incident in 1949, when the British warship Amethyst was sunk by the batteries on shore of the People's Liberation Army and the Red Navy in its first real international encounter, dealt swiftly with the British assault to the sovereignty of China by the sailing of a Royal Navy warship down the Yangtze. Well, maybe this will happen again, but probably not. China may well have decided that revenge is a dish best eaten cold, and if so, they have many tools with which to lever it. The Chinese economy, already the biggest manufacturing economy in the whole world, soon the biggest economy in the whole world, maybe even now, but not admitted. China is moving on up, whilst Europe and North America is sinking further down, not least because China is in no way involved in the economic warfare launched by Western countries against Russia over the Ukraine. China is building roads, highways, railways, airports, infrastructure of all kinds all over the world, not just in Africa, but Africa is the one the Americans perhaps fear most. The United States is building nothing at all, can build nothing at all, even in its own country. Its own infrastructure, bridges, roads, all kinds of civilian infrastructure is crumbling, often dangerously, while China goes from strength to strength, building super fast railways and the super fast broadband that comes in its wake. The future, therefore, belongs to China, not the United States. But What if the United States is prepared to gamble all on breaking China before it overtakes it? That is a question that occupies many people. Undoubtedly, many people were sorry to see Nancy Pelosi land somewhat unsteadily on her feet without being intercepted when she could actually have been. But it would have provoked a real international crisis, perhaps a military one. Pelosi was accompanied by a fleet of American warplanes coming from their bases in Japan. Any attempt to interdict the flight might well have led to a military collision between two nuclear-armed superpowers. The United States evidently was ready for that. China evidently was not ready for that, or perhaps was merely postponing the date. What price, then, will the United States pay for this latest insult to China and the latest breach of the One China policy? Well, at the moment, they look to be purely economic. Chinese investment in the United States economy, well, slow, may even be put on hold, may be scrapped altogether. China may decide to dump some of the United States debt and currency that it owns, more dollars, in fact, than the United States Treasury holds. But as the United States Treasury is based only on a printing press and nothing else, they could always run off more dollars, I'm sure. But China can affect the value of the dollar, can affect the value of American bonds in the bond market. It can do many things. But these two behemoths are surprisingly interdependent. The US cannot really afford, unless it's going to go to all-out war, a breach with China. And China perhaps cannot really afford, short of nuclear war, a whole breach with the United States. I'm surrounded by experts of different political stripes, and let me introduce them to you now. The expert of all experts, as far as I'm concerned, is Keith Bennett, China expert and co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. Keith, welcome back, and let's start with you. How did you see the crisis? How do you think each side handled it?
Right, that's an interesting question. There was an awful lot of very, very heated rhetoric in the Chinese media, and particularly on Chinese social media, but also in some papers like the Global Times in the build-up to Pelosi's visit. I never thought that the kind of more, shall we say, extreme suggestions would be carried through, because as you intimated, that could have easily triggered a war that could easily have turned into a nuclear war. But there was undoubtedly some disappointment among public opinion in China that the initial response when Pelosi landed was not what perhaps people were hoping for. And I think that's a very important factor to keep in mind, that consistently in the West, people don't take public opinion into account in China, and public opinion in China is very vocal and very organized on social media. And people in China feel intensely and emotionally about Taiwan in a way that it's actually very hard, I think, for people in the West to actually appreciate just how deeply they feel about it. So there was a kind of feeling that Pelosi had come and gone, and if you like, the Americans had got away with it. And then we saw the Chinese response starting to unfold, the economic measures, the suspension of cooperation with the United States on a whole range of issues, and of course the military exercises around Taiwan, which were quite unprecedented in their scope and scale. And what they actually showed was China's ability to completely surround Taiwan and in effect to blockade it if they so chose. And a short period of blockade by China of Taiwan will cause, immense havoc on global supply chains. I mean, forget the idea of getting a new mobile phone if that happens because of semiconductor production and so on. Of course, the Americans have protested very strongly about that. The Chinese response has been quite simple: don't say that we didn't warn you. But I think what's also important is what you said about the idea of revenge being a dish best eaten cold, in that what we saw was the beginning of the rolling out of a process. And this is not an issue that is going to go away, because I think that the Chinese leadership have concluded that what the United States has really been doing is salami slicing the One China policy, which they signed up to in 3 Sino-US joint communiques, which is the premise on which US-China diplomatic relations exist. And if they didn't take a stand now, then the whole One China policy and the whole basis of China-US relations would collapse. And I think it's very important also to understand that the Chinese always take a very long view of this. Their agenda is not driven by the morning's headlines, as British politics and American politics are. And I just to put this into some kind of perspective, the first Indian ambassador to the People's Republic of China was a man called Radhakrishnan. In fact, he was the last Indian ambassador to Chiang Kai-shek, the first to Mao. So he wrote a memoir called In Two Chinas, meaning the pre-liberation China and post-liberation China. And he talks about being taken around the Summer Palace in Beijing, which had been burnt to the ground by the 8 Allied powers, led by Britain and France at the turn of the 20th century. And the guide taking them around, and this is already 50 years later, itemizes what the British and the French stole and so on, and said, one day we're going to make them pay for this. So watch this space.
Now, Joseph Robertson, you take a very different view. You're a big supporter of Taiwan, and what you say is its importance to the UK. Your policy is different to the British Conservative government, at least on paper, but then you are from the Orthodox Conservatives group and are the strategic director of it. So give us your Orthodox Conservative perspective on these events.
Sure. Well, I mean, I have a slightly different perspective on Taiwan-Chinese relations, which is that Taiwan is China and the People's Republic of China is the breakaway. And I think if we're going to be historically accurate, that's always the basis to speak of about those relations. So when I look at the one nation policy of China, I always add a caveat to it, which is that, yes, many nations signed up to the one China policy with the caveat of 2 systems. That was first to include Hong Kong, secondly to include Taiwan in the future. That policy has already been broken by China, by the People's Republic of China, by 25 years. We're 25 years on now from the handover of Hong Kong by the British to the Chinese, and that was meant to extend to 2047. And what we've seen with the national security law and the takeover of the Hong Kong courts and essentially a mockery of the Hong Kong system in the last couple of years by the CCP is a breakaway from that pact. And who's to say that they're not going to follow up by doing the same with Taiwan? That's my fear. Now, not to say that they want to escalate. There's been good points made already. I don't think either side really want to escalate. I think probably the biggest offence by sending Pelosi over was to the US themselves, that was all they could muster up. I kind of see Chinese foreign policy as a little bit like a K-pop, if you like, polished on the outside, this sort of wonderful world of figurines and with a very dark side underneath. And I see US foreign policy as a bit more like Ozzy Osbourne, lovable rogue, seems a bit fierce, but really stumbling around like a drunk behind the scenes. And I think this is the dynamic we've got going on the world stage now. Both are a little bit unstable in different ways. China is definitely economically on the up, probably going to surpass the US, but it's got its own issues at home. By constantly forcing more lockdowns on its people, by constantly pursuing the zero COVID policy as a means, I think, to stress test its population in case of any confrontation. We've seen that take an economic dive in some areas. And I think both are equally vulnerable right now. We could see a balance of power flip in the next 5 to 10 years. But I think the reality is that China's broken promises, mainly which affect the British, and by virtue of the fact that the West operates as an alliance of some sorts, therefore has overstepped with the US. Do I think that the US are capable of contending with the Chinese? Absolutely not. I think that they have taken a back foot for too long. They had a brief revival under Trump, and now they're sliding away again into probably what will be insignificance in 50 years from now.
Let's hear from Alexander Mackay, a podcaster, host and political activist, host of Red Star Radio podcast. Alexander, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Always good to be here.
Did this trip come out of the blue? Did people think that Nancy Pelosi was bluffing?
Well, George, it didn't come out of the blue. I mean, it's a escalation of a series of decisions made by the United States government over a number of years now to try and find pressure points to apply to the Chinese government. They tried to apply pressure to China over the situation in Xinjiang, the so-called Uyghur genocide, with a lot of allegations that they never proved. They tried to create a situation or exploit a situation in Hong Kong for many months in 2019. And now they've moved to trying to exploit the tensions that do exist between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan. And the aim really is to slow down or stop Chinese growth by creating tensions and contradictions within China itself. And that is why Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan was regarded as a threat by the government of the PRC. And because they recognize that it represents another attempt by the American administration that's been escalating since at least 2008 to find ways to cause internal problems in China itself. And that is the context in which this trip must be viewed, I believe, George. It must be viewed as a further continuation of the US policy that has run consistently since the administration of Barack Obama through Donald Trump and now into Joe Biden.
Why do you think the US decided to escalate the standoff with China at this time?
I think that the US fell into this problem because they are desperately looking for ways to assert themselves. Their actions have provoked a war in Ukraine, which is not going well for the Ukrainians, who the US has backed very extensively and expensively with all kinds of weapons and aid. They got humiliated in Afghanistan last year. They were scuttled out of there and made a mess of their withdrawal. The US has been looking for ways to assert itself again. And so therefore, when Pelosi announced a number of months ago now that she was looking to go to Taiwan, suddenly this became a US political issue whereby Pelosi first said she had COVID and couldn't go, then she could go again. And it became an issue of party politics in the United States as well. They need to desperately try and assert themselves. They feel the need to assert themselves against the Chinese, against the Russians. But in the end, ultimately, I think that this has weakened their cause because it seems that the trip of Pelosi was received very badly inside Taiwan itself because she was greeted with big demonstrations from the Taiwanese people who realize that the game that the United States government is playing and that they don't want to be manipulated into a conflict like the Ukrainians were.
China has no wish for conflict with the US and the West, but now it seems China's being dragged into that conflict.
I think in the long run, the Chinese government's position hasn't actually changed. They published a white paper on what they see as the future of China-Taiwan relations, which is the integration of Taiwan into the People's Republic of China under the one country, two systems doctrine that they've used to integrate Macau and Hong Kong. They made it clear in that document that they want to see the integration of Taiwan into China via peaceful means. But they also make clear that they will not tolerate any attempt by the United States and its allies to turn Taiwan into some kind of armed camp that the United States and its allies did with Ukraine. They will not tolerate the further fostering of what they regard as the secessionist aspirations of the current government of Taiwan, led by the Democratic Party of Taiwan. And they will assert what they regard as their sovereign rights over the whole of China via military means if forced to do so. And they make it very clear in their policy announcements that they regard military force as a last resort, but it is there as an option.
What was the benefit to the US of this step in escalating the crisis? Many struggle to find any benefit for the US out of this at all.
Well, I think in the short term, they may their arms companies may benefit if they try to get the Taiwanese to buy more weaponry from the United States. That's always a motivation. But I think that the US policy has been revealed as being rather stupid over the course of the last few years, to be honest, George. I think that they the one thing that they always tried to avoid in the past was having their major competitors, the Russians and the Chinese, unite together. And their policy in the last few years has managed to forge an almost unbreakable alliance between the Russian and Chinese governments at a time when the US was looking to pick them off and divide them. But they've managed, through their actions in both Taiwan and Ukraine, to weld these two powers together in a way that wouldn't have been possible otherwise.
Professor Michael Dutton, Professor of Politics at the Goldsmiths University in London, and also a joint professor with a Chinese university. Why do you think the US did this? It was a very risky thing to do unless they knew that China wasn't going to respond in line with much of Chinese public opinion, at a time when they're already effectively at war in Ukraine, giving them a war on two fronts.
Yeah, I think it's almost baffling if you don't take into account the fact that there's internal politics within the United States. I think Pelosi's visit was, in many respects, quite opportunistic. It kind of fits in with the social warrior model, so it'll attract votes in China. Plus, I'm not sure I agree with the last speaker in terms of tying together Obama, Trump, and now on to Biden. I'd say what's been happening between the various political factions in the United States has been almost an inflation in the way in which they've dealt with China, so that China becomes an ever more increasing threat, and the other side then can't back down from it, otherwise they look too weak on the China front. I think it's not by chance that Pelosi goes just before congressional elections. So in terms of the United States, I think we have to fit that into, if there is a grand plan at all now, I think it's a grand plan of containment. And frankly, the gate's already open and the horse is bolted. The fact is that China has been the factory of the world now for decades, and it's part of a global supply chain that, in a sense, was supported by the Americans and promoted by the Americans. We now have a situation where it's changed dramatically. It's changed on both sides, not just in America, but also with the rise of Xi Jinping and the Idailu, the One Belt, One Road system, which is actually kind of seen by the Americans, I think, as a threat and something that needs to be contained. So I think in that wider understanding, you can understand how these things will emerge as problems. I want to go back to something Keith said, because I think it's crucially important. I think it just nobody takes any notice of it. And that is the fact that Chinese people feel very strongly about Taiwan because Taiwan is part of an unresolved problem of colonialism. And if we're talking about, as it were, false promises, that's the false promises that the Chinese will go back to about colonialism and the thing that colonialism has done, which is basically tear up the country. Remember that that the country was not unified for so long because of Western imperialism. So from the Chinese perspective, the Taiwan issue is an unresolved historical issue. Let me go to Hong Kong. I remember I was in China, in Beijing in 1997, and driving to a friend's place. We were having a celebration around the return of Hong Kong. And I went round the ring roads, which Beijing's surrounded by a series of ring roads. And the third ring road is one of the main ones. And on every crossing, there was a huge banner in Chinese saying, 100 years of humiliation over. In the sense, for the Chinese people, these are unresolved colonial issues. If you look at, within that framework, if we start to look at each of these issues and start to unpack them, we can see quite different perspectives and we can see quite different initiatives. But overall, the problem is one, it seems to me, of instead of China being a strategic partner, which it's always claimed it wants to be, America has decided it is the new enemy and it's all about containment.
Much more of this coming up after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen Television, coming from London, discussing China, the United States, and Taiwan. Let's cross to the United States and speak with Scott Ritter, former United Nations weapons inspector, former intelligence officer in the U.S. Marines. Scott, welcome to the show.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Did Nancy Pelosi go to Taiwan of her own volition?
It's clear that Nancy Pelosi has had sought to go to Taiwan for some time. I think her original travel plans were back in April, but she was precluded because of COVID. When she made it, when she announced that she was planning to undertake this trip in August, she was told by people straight up, including the President of the United States, don't do this, don't go. But she is, of course, the Speaker of the House. She's number 2 in the line of succession. She is a senior member of an independent branch of government. And so even though Joe Biden didn't want her to go, he couldn't order her not to go without creating a political crisis between one of his most important political allies, whom he needs the support of to pursue some very aggressive domestic political agendas on the eve of a critical midterm election. So, I mean, yes, Biden could have ordered the military not to provide her with an airplane. He didn't do that. He instead said, the military doesn't think it's a good time for you to go. And the military backed that up by saying this could create a crisis. The State Department made it clear that she wasn't representing American foreign policy. She wasn't there to reinforce existing diplomatic points. So I think the shorter answer is yes, she went on her own volition. This was very much a rogue operation carried out by Nancy Pelosi to pursue goals that only Nancy Pelosi was pursuing. They weren't in concert with the rest of American policy.
Isn't this damaging to U.S. credibility that they make agreements, but they're not really worth the paper they're written on, like the scrapping of Obama's nuclear deal with Iran? Now we've got Biden effectively scrapping the decisions made by the Nixon and Kissinger administration and endorsed by every U.S. government, at least on paper, ever since.
Look, as you pointed out, this is not a problem that's unique to the Biden administration. It's endemic to the American political reality. Every 4 years, we hold a national election for presidents. Sometimes these presidents get elected and they serve 2 terms. Sometimes they only serve 1 term. But the bottom line is when you examine in the post-Cold War era American politics, we careen from Republican to Democrat to Republican to Democrat to Republican to Democrat, back and forth, and there's no consistency. So an agreement that's entered into 20 years ago may become politically inconvenient for a politician who's only going to be holding office for 4 to 8 years. But the ramifications of the decisions that are made, especially if they reverse these past agreements, are real, especially for those who enter the agreements with the United States. The United States has shown itself not to be a reliable negotiating partner, because it doesn't matter that if the current incumbent in the White House is negotiating in good faith, whatever is agreed upon can be undone by those who replace him. So you say, is it damaging to American credibility, damaging to American foreign policy? Incredibly damaging, but that's always been the case.
Scott, it could be me that's stupid, or it could be the U.S. administration that's stupid. I'm genuinely struggling to see where the benefit for the United States, for its government, for its people, even for its military, in taking this particular step at this particular time. Am I missing something?
In order to believe something, you need to have knowledge. And that knowledge needs to be backed by experience in order for your belief to be credible. If you take a look at what passes for discussion, debate, dialogue about China and the relationship between the United States and China today at the highest levels of the U.S. government, it's as shallow as can be. I mean, more often than not, we have senior representatives of the United States Congress dismissing anything that comes out of China as simply communist propaganda, as if China isn't a nation of, more than 1 billion people with a long history and a government that's shown itself to be far more stable over time than the United States government, with policies that are resonating globally. I mean, China is everywhere, it seems, especially economically. This is the kind of discussion that should be had, an in-depth discussion about the reality of China. But the American people don't want to have that kind of discussion. There's an old saying in the United States, when you're explaining, you're losing. And no politician wants to be explaining anything to his electorate. They just want to say something and have the electorate nod blindly and vote yes.
Keith Bennett, what, apart from that remarkable ending, Scott Ritter was saying is that deals with America, agreements with America, are not worth the paper that they are written on. And we've seen that over the Iran nuclear deal. We're now seeing it surely over the One China policy. China concentrates on reiterating over and over that America is committed to a One China policy. And the US responds robotically, yes, we are committed to it, but they're not in practice. So the question is, at what point does China say the US is going to ratchet up tension over Taiwan until the point that it actually takes military action against us? So will China take preemptive action like Scott Ritter said?
Well, the honest answer to that is I don't know. And Scott was very definite in his views, but I suspect he doesn't know either. I mean, there's a clear danger of escalation, perhaps of miscalculation on one side or the other, which could create a new reality. If you look at history, most wars don't start deliberately. They, as was the book that was produced for the 100th anniversary of the First World War, talked about sleepwalking to war. And, there is a danger of that. I mean, the Chinese have always been absolutely clear that they will not renounce the possibility of the use of force to resolve the Taiwan question. But they have also said that that is not their preferred solution, and they would see it very much as a last resort. And those things relate to formal declaration of Taiwan independence or similar moves on the part of the United States. So we're going to have to wait and see.
Professor Dutton, the apocalyptic vision painted there by a former intelligence officer in the Marine Corps, a former United Nations weapons inspector, that would knock the Yangtze Incident into a cocked hat, wouldn't it? It's one thing sinking a decrepit old steamer of the declining Royal Navy, of the dying British Empire. It would be a different thing to fire on the US Navy in its pomp, even without the SS Ronald Reagan.
I think each one of these moves that are being made are escalating things to a dangerous degree, and I agree with you. You can sleepwalk into a problem here. I think the best thing that can happen is to ratchet this down as quickly as possible. Because it seems to me, in fact, the more you do this, it seems like toxic masculinity to simply prove who's got a bigger fleet than the other one. It's a crazy moment which actually needs to be ratcheted down. The fact is that that entire period from the time Nixon did the deal with the Chinese and the idea of a strategic ambiguity or whatever came into effect, this has been a long time when we should have been talking about how to resolve this issue peacefully. And it's got to the point now where China has grown, it's become a powerful, as you've said, it's become a powerful world power. And as a consequence, it is asserting its sovereign right. What it sees as its sovereign right to hold its country together. And therefore, particularly with issues like Taiwan, these are non-negotiable. And the Americans have to start to wake up to the fact that they need to deal with this issue differently and cannot deal with it militarily, because I think we just need to look. It's not called the South China Sea for nothing. It's next to China, not next to America. It is part of China. Taiwan is seen as part of China, and as a consequence of that, the Chinese will not brook any opposition to the idea that Taiwan is part of China. And as long as America constantly insists on trying to make this and push it militarily, we are going to be in a position where we chance a world war and we chance extinction. I think it's really dangerous.
Well, you would ratchet it down unless you viewed China as an existential threat that must be stopped at one point. And if China knows that the US regards it so, then the only remaining question is who will take the initiative. Do you bide your time until the US decide that they're going to decisively stop you, or do you act when you can? I could make an argument, I don't speak for China, of course, that this is the best possible time to confront the United States. It's bogged down in the Ukraine. I could make an argument that China should sink the SS Ronald Reagan, which might be why they're not sending it.
Yes, but if you made that argument, you'd also be courting, like, the extinction of the world. I mean, this could blow up into a world war. China will not back down from Taiwan. The bottom line is it will not back down on that issue. And we have to figure out a way to deal with that issue, and it should have been dealt with earlier. And it should have been dealt with, frankly, by people sitting around a table and trying to figure out a way forward.
Yeah, but you say that, forgive me, with all respect, as if this were an academic thing. Yes. Taiwan is being used by the United States to weaken and block China. They don't care. Joseph cares about the Taiwanese, but Joe Biden doesn't even know them. Pelosi Jr., who accompanied his mother on the trip, and is on the board of 2 lithium companies, and it was purely coincidental that Taiwan is the biggest exporter of lithium. But leave these little personal interests aside. This is not about finding a solution to Taiwan. Taiwan is merely a stick, a weapon against China, isn't it?
Look, I'd like to take you back a few years. To answer that, I'd like to take you back a few years. We are now talking about containment of China, about the potentiality of a world war. Remember back when Cameron was bringing Xi Jinping around, and it was the golden era. We have moved from that golden era when people could actually talk to one another and actually try and negotiate a way forward to one where now China has become an enemy. And it's been creeping up, essentially. You know, it's happening in Australia. It happened with Trump, with his China disease, and that kind of whole vilification of China. And if you remember, we're old enough, at least some of us are old enough on this panel, to remember back into the 70s when Ezra Vogel was writing a book on Japan #1 and Japan being the biggest threat to America. China is a double threat to America. What we've got now is a system which can be characterized as communist. It can be characterized as Chinese, and it can be and foreign, and a threat to America. So that existential threat is one that's essentially been hyped up over the last few years, at the same time that Xi Jinping has been launching the One Belt, One Road. So it's in a sense, it's actually more than a perfect time. It's a perfect storm.
Joseph, apocalypse now? Do you agree with Scott Ritter, or do you agree with Professor Dutton that we need to talk everyone down from the tree?
Well, I think the thing to make clear here is that the apocalypse that is happening is at home. And one thing that the Chinese have in their advantage in this situation is a stringent moral compass. It might not be our flavour of morality and it may not be democratic, but they have a very hard line that they will adhere to no matter what. The West doesn't have that anymore. Its exports were democracy, liberty, sovereignty, and a few trade routes and a few of their own interests. Those things have all been lost. Americans don't believe in their own democracy. The British barely do. I mean, the latest Tory leadership campaign is all we need to know that essentially things are stolen from people over here. We don't believe in our own democracy anymore. So what do we actually have to export with any real level of dignity that can make us stand up to China with any backbone if it came to conflict? And that's one reason why I care about Taiwan as a country, is because they are a beacon of democracy. They have had a booming economy separate from China's influence. They have become one of the largest exporters of semiconductors, as we know, of lithium, of things that are important to the Western economy. And they've done that completely outside of all the globalist structures and initiatives that the West use to implement their own agendas around the world. They're not part of the WHO. They're not part of Interpol. They're not part of any of the big global organizations, most of which have incorporated China in some way into their policies. And they're doing things by themselves with a democratic mandate from their own people as a sovereign nation. Do I think Pelosi should have gone there purely based on her own interests? No, I'm not here to defend US foreign policy. I think it was a terrible idea. But do I believe that the Taiwanese people should be stood up for by the West based on the fact that they're doing the West better than the West does the West nowadays in terms of their own sovereignty and their own democracy? Yeah, totally.
Stood up for to the point of war?
Why not? What are we here to defend? You know, and I'm not advocating conflict. I agree with your point. We could be sleepwalking into a nuclear holocaust. I said that about the Ukraine situation. I think we've been creating proxy wars for long enough, or the US certainly has, all over the world, just to fuel its interests, that when we get to the edge of a real conflict where it's not so much about oil and it suddenly becomes about the existential crisis of the entire West, did the US have the backbone to stand up in a war? I think it's worth doing. If China invaded Taiwan, should we defend them? I think so. But I don't know if we can.
You're the first person in my life that I have ever met that is ready to face the extinction of the human race for Formosa. Keith, final word to you. Let's assume no apocalypse, no war. How does China reunify this last piece of its jigsaw?
Well, Michael really made the point that things are actually on one level quite difficult now because of the trouble that there was in Hong Kong, which in my view was basically stirred up by outside forces, Britain and America, to undermine the one country, two systems policy. So there is a, there's a problem there. But what's missing, and what's missing in what my friend over there just said, is that one of the reasons why Taiwan's economy has been doing rather well is that by far its biggest trading partner is mainland China. And at least in pre-COVID times, millions of people cross the Taiwan Straits every year. Taiwan has massive investment on the mainland. There are hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese people on the mainland living, working, having families, running businesses, studying, and so on. And this process was really going quite well. I mean, people forget because memories are very short in the West, but in 2015, Xi Jinping and the then leader of Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou, had a pretty cordial meeting in Singapore and reached a whole lot of agreements. And it's only then when the Democratic Progressive Party came in that they've wrecked that and brought us to a situation which could be the edge of war. But what they're doing doesn't represent the interests of everyone in Taiwan. But China's proposal for one country, two systems and peaceful reunification is still on the table. But one thing which I think has been touched on during this discussion, one thing that's really not negotiable is that China, no matter what, when it comes to it, no matter what the cost, will not back down on this question of reunification, because it is the final piece in the jigsaw, if you like, of returning China to basically the place that China held in the world through most of recorded history. If you look at the last 2,000 years, China was the leading economy in the world in about 16, 17 of the last 20 centuries. And this century of humiliation, which began with the British smuggling drugs into China and leading to the first Opium War in 1840, this century of humiliation, the final undoing of that and the realization of what Xi Jinping calls the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is the reunification of Taiwan with the motherland. And if it means, war with the United States, that's the last thing that China wants to see, but they won't back down from it. And I just finish with, again, based on some of the things that Michael was saying about his experiences in China, there's a book by a British businessman called Tom Clissold, who's lived in China for many years, and he recounts going to a small remote village in China, and a little boy of 6 or 7 realizes that he's from Britain, and he comes home and says, "You're the people responsible for the Opium War." Now, no one in British schools knows about the Opium Wars, but in China they do.
In China, they do. They have long memories, and they quite like eating the dish called revenge cold. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalimahora. Thank you for watching.